Thank you, Elisa. It's always in media sessions that we have trouble with technology, never in any other session. There's something about poltergeist, I'm sure. Thank you very much for inviting me here. What I'd like to do, in preparation for Justine's comments about virtual children and interactions with interactive technologies, is I'd like to provide a little bit more of a historical context, an overview about children and media research, and tell you a little bit about some of the research that's been going on for the last 100 or so years, because the reality is research on children and media really goes back to the very first decade of the 20th century, which most people don't know, but that is the case. Children have always been viewed as a special audience for media, at least starting with the introduction of film. And with each of the 20th century media, film, radio, television, and later the electronic and digital technologies, there have been a history of recurring public controversies about the power of these media to influence children and the appropriateness of media content for child audiences. Social science research, news media and public policy, and concerned parents have all focused on how media, first of all, seem to be picked up by and entrance and engage children at very young ages, and how it colonizes their leisure time, and then how these media influence their knowledge and their social behavior. By the turn of the 21st century, the interactive media, especially video games, the internet, and now cell phones, iPods, and all of the interactive toys that we have available, have become the focus of a new round of public controversy. The public discussions of interactive media today is very reminiscent of earlier media, with both optimism. The people who are the Pollyannas believe that these new technologies are going to fundamentally change children's lives because they'll have new means of educating them at younger and younger ages, and the Cassandras, who are fearful about other sorts of content, usually violent content and commercialized content, and how that's going to have a negative impact on children. I really want to talk about three things. I want to unpack this history, and part of the reason I want to unpack it is because that's a history that for the last 30 years everyone's been reciting. And I want to offer a slightly more nuanced view of it in the wake of some recent research that I've been doing with my student Mike Robb at UCR, to talk about that there's really been a shift since the advent of television, and it's a shift that makes it more important than ever that we study media in the context of all of children's development. Secondly, I want to talk specifically about what we know about the kind of inroads on children's time media make. And then thirdly, I want to talk about three issues, and I chose these issues specifically because they are of concern today regarding children's development, but they also have been topics of recurring public interest, and those issues are commercialization and advertising in the wake of today, the obesity crisis, but historically the commercialization of youth, violent content, which is a perennial issue and in some ways has colonized most of the literature about media and children and youth. And thirdly, I want to talk about the question of children's learning. Can children learn, and at what ages do they begin to learn from these screen and interactive media? I want to talk about the television era and beyond. As I said, media have always been concerned to parents, but historically, and indeed if you look at the literature about child development, the traditional socializing forces in children's lives have been parents, schools, peers, sometimes the church. And where media have been focused on, it's been by a narrow range of interest and studies. And yet, if you look at the course of youth's lives, starting in the 20th century, what we find is that beginning with the teens and 20s, particularly the 20s, and the rise of the flapper generation, media from film on, if you believe historian Richard Bush, began to focus on youth as a target audience. But youth meant different things in different eras. In the 20s, it was the flappers, who were really the first generation of American youth to have their own media products directed to them, their own magazines, their own films, their own lifestyles, the short hair, the short skirts, the smoking, and the running around in roadsters. It was a youth culture that was commercialized and catered to by the mass media. That was the first youth culture that was commercialized. Secondly, in the 30s and 40s, particularly the 40s, we saw the rise, with sort of signified by 17 magazine in 1944, which came along, of teenagers, which became the next youth culture of importance. And teenagers in the 40s and 50s also began to have their own movies. I Was a Teenage Werewolf, their own music. First, the Bobby Soxers in the 40s with, what's his name? Frank Sinatra. And then the Elvis Presley and rock and rollers of the 50s. And they had their own hang-ups and their own places, so that media became an important role of defining what youth culture was about, as well as marketing products specifically to teens. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, it became school-age children, with the rise of KidVid on Saturday morning in the 1960s, which was a compilation of animated, cheaply produced animated cartoon shows on Saturday morning with lots of advertising for heavily sugared cereals and toys. We began to market to the grade school age child. And what's happened since 2000? Baby Einstein's My First TV, which is a cable channel directly devoted to preschoolers and indeed to children under the age of 2. So what we see historically is inroads by the mass media and commercialization to ever younger age groups of children, and the creation of media and content for ever younger age groups of children over the course of the 20th and into the 21st century. To say that American children live in a media-saturated lives, and here I'm using data from the national survey that Kaiser Family Foundation conducted in 2005, where they had diaries, children keep diaries, ages from 8 to 18-year-olds. To say that children live media-saturated lives is an overstatement. Media are everywhere around children, not only in the home, but increasingly in the schools and elsewhere as media become more portable. One of the things that we notice is that the advent of television has brought with it a whole host of new kinds of media that are ever more portable and privatized. I just give you some of the statistics of what's available in the average American home today. It's really a remarkable array when you think about it. But what I really want to talk about is the amount of time that children spend with these media. When we say that media have been a part of American children's lives since the start of the 20th century, that's true. When we say that there have been recurring controversies, that's true. But something shifted around the time of the advent of television. Let me give you just a few examples of what I mean. If you compare the amount of leisure time that youth had in the teens compared to the 1930s, compared to the 1980s, you notice that media have become the major aspect of children's leisure time. Let me compare some data. There was a study conducted in 1911, a survey of 1,140 11 to 14-year-old adolescents in New York City. This study found, and was really promoted of the day as shocking, that youth were spending an inordinate amount of time with films. They estimated that youth in 1911 went to the Nickelodeon or film about 1 or 2 times a week, which averaged somewhere between 4 and 5 hours of their time. This is in the era before radio and before there are magazines directed at youth. So the major mass medium of the day is film. Skip ahead to the 1930s, when Lindbergh and his colleagues, sociologists who were doing a variety of community studies, conduct Elmtown's Youth, a study in Westchester County, New York. And he has these youth, 795 high school students, construct diaries that looks at the amount of time that they spend in a variety of pursuits, both in school and out of school. He notes an enormous increase in the leisure time of these high schoolers. He found, for instance, 7 hours of leisure time, that is time not devoted to work or to schooling during weekdays, and another 11 hours averaged over a weekend from these diary studies. How much time was spent with media? Appalling, he says. He found, on average, 4 hours and 40 minutes per week of radio use, and averaging, again, 1 to 2 movies per week for another 5 hours, or about 10 hours of the available leisure time for these youth were devoted to media. So we go from 4.5 hours per week to maybe 11 hours. And there were calls in the 30s of concern about the colonization of children's time from media. Skip ahead to the 2005 study by the Kaiser Family Foundation. 8 to 18-year-olds spend an average today of nearly 6.5 hours per day with media. And it's primarily screen media. Television still dominates, even though children are using other media as well. And most remarkable, preschoolers are spending an average at least 2 hours a day with screen media, and this doesn't account for some of the other technologies they're using. That kind of qualitative shift, I want to submit, also represents a qualitative difference in the role of media in children's development in ways that we really haven't articulated, and that one can't really compare the role of media in earlier generations to the dominance it plays in how children spend their time today. The other aspect of how they spend their time today with media is that it's a much more backdrop for daily life. In an analysis of Kaiser data that Elizabeth Van de Water and Vicki Ryder and I collected in 2003 on children from birth to 6 years of age, we found that 39% of the children under the age of 6 live in households in which the television is on almost constantly, what we call constant TV households. These are homes in which the television is turned on in the morning, it's on during meal times, and it is turned off at night when the children go to bed. 39% in a national sample of 1,000 children. Television, number one, is a backdrop to daily life. And we know that television can interfere with young children focusing on other activities, particularly adult television. Secondly, we know that television has become a very privatized activity for children. It's not just television and other media. It's not just that children are engaging in these activities in social groups. It's that it becomes private, portable. 68% of 8 to 18-year-olds have television sets in their bedrooms, according to the 2005 Kaiser study. 36% of children 4 to 6 have television sets in their bedrooms. And according to the Kaiser 0 to 6 study, a quarter of babies under the age of 2 have television sets in their bedrooms. And when we pursued asking parents why they have television sets in their bedrooms, we were told that one of the major reasons was to help the child fall asleep at night. Third, when you add up all this media, it's over 10 hours a day. What we find is that there aren't enough leisure time hours for children to use all of these media. And so what we find is that children are increasingly multitaskers. That means not just that they're using media when they do their homework, but they're using multiple media simultaneously. Indeed, in the Kaiser study from 2005, 26% of the time, youth were 8 to 18-year-olds were engaged in using more than one medium at a time. And what we don't know is how the content which traverses these different platforms of media are engaged in different ways, reinforce each other, or the implications for what is taken away from these media content, what's learned, and what implication it has. But we know that multitasking is, if anything, increasing. What I didn't point out is that there are also variations. I just gave you general trends, but we know that there are variations in media use by age, by gender, by ethnicity, and the extent to which subgroups use media in different ways. African American youth, for instance, are much heavier users of television than other ethnicities. Older teens spend more time with computers and listening to music, and less time video game playing, and that boys are more likely to use video games while girls are more likely to listen to music. These variations also probably have implications in ways that we haven't studied very well. But we have studied some issues. The amount of time that children spend isn't the only issue. It's really content. So a second truism in this whole literature is that it's not just amount of time with media, it's what content are children attending to. And three kinds of content have been of a special concern throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. Commercialized content, because it was obvious that media were catering and commercializing youth culture. Violent content, of concern since the earliest days of film. And educational content. What are children learning? And can we harness the power of these media to teach useful things to children? Let me talk a little bit about the advertising. Why is advertising of concern? Well, starting in the 1970s, there have been a whole slew of studies that have documented the extent to which children must come to understand what advertising messages are about, and that there is a developmental progression. Somewhere around 4 or 5 years old, starting at 4 usually, children can discriminate in the context of TV advertising, which when these studies started, by the way, in the 1970s, that was the main form of advertising to children. It was on television, it wasn't in other venues. Children can discriminate which is an ad from which is other program content. But that doesn't mean they necessarily understand what the purpose of that advertisement is about. Do they understand, quote-unquote, persuasive intent that an ad is trying to sell them a product? For that to happen, it typically occurs somewhere between 5 and 8 years of age. And depending on which study you look at, the APA, in their review by Dale Kunkel's review, says that under age 8 children don't understand persuasive intent, but there's increasing studies that suggest that you can teach it to children somewhere between 5 and 8. When they understand persuasive intent, that is that the ad wants to sell them a product, they still may not be wary consumers of the advertising messages. That is, do they take into account the notion that because the advertiser is trying to sell them a product, therefore the advertiser has a point of view about the product, and the information may be biased, and therefore the information needs to be questioned in a way that adults are likely to question it. That developmental progression, that kind of understanding probably doesn't occur until children are about 11 or 12, and comes as a result, typically, from early research that I did with my colleagues in a book called How Children Learn to Buy, from children actually buying products that they see advertised on TV, they bring them home and they're not what they expected. They're disappointed. And those real-world experiences lead the children to understand the context differently. Yet we know children are exposed to substantial amounts of advertising. These data are from a research study that was released last week by the Kaiser Family Foundation looking at advertising on television. And they're slightly less, these estimates are lower than estimates I would have used 2 weeks ago. Those estimates were based on looking at the number of ads per hour during children's time and multiplying it by the number of hours on average we thought children watched. These data combine both the number of ads on specific children's channels and children's shows multiplied by studies of children actually watching those shows. So it's a much better estimate and substantially lower estimates. The APA study, for instance, estimated that children are exposed to about 40,000 ads per year, and our estimate is much lower today. That doesn't mean it's any less powerful than we thought earlier. And why is it of particular concern today? Well, there's been another shift since the 1960s. From the 1960s until the mid-1990s, which is when the last study was done on advertising on children's shows, there were 3 big categories that were typically, it was almost constant across the decades, of which kinds of ads for which kinds of foods were available, or which kinds of products. It was cereal advertising, snack foods, and toys. What the most recent Kaiser data demonstrates is if you look at exposure by different age groups, nonetheless, food advertising represents today 50% of all ads available to children on television. And the problem is that these are ads for foods that are not necessarily the kinds of foods that you want your children to eat. They are called high-density caloric foods. That means they're high in sugar, they're high in calories, and they're low in nutrients that are essential for children. That means that they're primarily candy and snack foods, cereals, and fast food outlets. And it's this focus on food advertising and the kinds of messages that the food advertisements present, which is the appeal to taste, it tastes really good, and to fun, and then to other ways of trying to get the child to buy the product, premiums or context, and very little appeal to nutritional claims about why the product might be good for you to use. Why is this of concern? Well, you all know about the obesity crisis, which I would submit has probably been the implication of how food advertising is implicated in the obesity crisis, may be one of the unintended consequences of our not doing anything about food advertising over the years. Advertising to children and TV advertising to children has been of concern going back to the 1970s. We first didn't like the fact that hosts would sell products to children. And then in 1978, there was a special investigation by the Federal Trade Commission really concerned about food advertising. In the late 70s, it was conceptualized as concerns about dental caries, that these sugared cereals and sugary snack foods were causing all kinds of dental problems. Obesity was not part of the issue. The FTC investigated and chose not to have any rulemaking in the area. Actually, it blew up in their faces. The FTC nearly lost, well, did lose its funding for about 3 weeks when the toy industry was able to shut down Congress's ability to pass an Appropriations Act to give money to the Federal Trade Commission, because they argued that the FTC did not have standing to investigate television advertising. The FTC staff at the time was recommending limits on food advertising and was recommending no advertising to children too young to understand the persuasive intent, that is, no advertising to preschool children at least. That investigation shut down and advertising went on, and what happened? We saw a huge increase in new kinds of food products for children, and we come along by 2004 and recognize that we have an obesity crisis in childhood today. And the 2004 IOM study on childhood obesity takes an ecological view and says there are all kinds of things that contribute to childhood obesity. It's the kinds of foods in the home, it's the socialization of parents of what children eat, it's what's available in schools, it's what the Department of Agriculture provides subsidies for, and the foods that we bring into the schools, and it may actually be something having to do with food marketing. The 2005, actually I should say 2006 when it was actually released, IOM study on food marketing and the diets of children and youth examined over 200 studies to see what the implications were for how food marketing might be implicated in children's diets. And what did they find? They concluded that, indeed, food advertising and food marketing is implicated in the foods that children choose, their food preferences. It's positively and strongly related to short-term food choices, what they ask for after they see an ad. But it may be more tenuously related to adiposity, that is the actual fatness. Why do they say tenuously? Because we have very few studies that actually connect exposure to television advertising with measures of fatness. In a wonderful review that you heard about last night when Lisa gave her speech by Elizabeth Vanderwater, she does a pretty terrific analysis in the Pediatrics Journal from last year, looking at the relationship of television and obesity, and concludes it's not just the couch potato argument, as you heard, that children are sitting in front of the television set and not moving, it's food marketing. And so now there's a huge number of attempts to influence what kinds of foods are advertised to children. And we have 2 years from the time of the IOM study before Congress may intervene to try to change the nature of food advertising to children. I'm going to go fast to the television violence study. TV violence has been of concern from the very earliest days, because violence has always been a mainstay of American media content. There was a formula that was found in particular in the 1994-98 National TV Violence Study, a formula which I suppose is still operative today. It's that there is a steady diet of TV programs that contain violence, over 60% of this huge national sample, and we sampled over 10,000 television shows over the course of those 3 years across the landscape of cable television. That's a huge amount of violence present, and that's real-world interpersonal violence, not just verbal violence. Much of it is glamorized, that is, it's the hero who's the perpetrator of violence. It's sanitized, you don't see the blood and the gore and the guts, and it looks like violence really doesn't hurt. And it's trivialized. An enormous amount of violence, over 40% of violent acts occur in the context of humor. So it's not something that is of concern. And most frightening of all, where you could show violence to give an anti-violence message, only 5% of the incidents in which violence occurs has an anti-violence message. That is, the perpetrator of violence showed some remorse. That's all they had to do. Or you showed some consequence to the family of the violent act. So we don't even use the occasion to show anti-violence. Effects of media violence, well, you know, it's pretty consistent across literally thousands, 3,500, 3,600 studies of media violence. There are 3 kinds of harmful effects. We know that kids can learn aggressive attitudes and behaviors. We know that they can become desensitized to any given act of violence, and we know that there's an increased fear of victimization. In a wonderful analysis, Bushman and Anderson demonstrate that the correlation between TV violence and particularly aggressive behavior is stronger than the correlation between smoking and lung cancer, if you look across all of the reviews. And yet, there is a consistent lack of agreement or interest in doing anything about the TV violence relationship. It also is implicated in children's fear reactions. This is research by Joanne Cantor over the years, has demonstrated that in retrospective reports, even college freshmen report being frightened by a TV show. 90% of them report intense fear reactions from their childhood, sleep disturbances, mental preoccupations with a violent act, and a general avoidance of violence as a consequence of that, and that these are long-term consequences. There have been policies regarding media violence. The V-chip was put into television sets starting in 2001. We have rating systems for TVs and video games and movies, and we've tried to have some state prohibitions of sales of violent games, and periodically Congress does another investigation. In fact, they're gearing up right now to have an investigation into marketing of violent films. But fundamentally, the production of violent content marches on. Lastly, young children in media. Historically, if you look at the development of content directed at children, whenever there's been a spike in public concerns about violent or sexual content, media producers have reacted historically, at least in the radio, the film and radio and early television eras of trying to get more positive educational programming for children. What's happened is that educational programming, really starting with the Sesame Street studies, has suggested three things. One, we have ever younger age groups of children that we get educational content for, and now it's young babies, which has posed a new sort of concern. Secondly, when we really study it, we find that children can learn from this educational content. And what do we find? We find that there's positive parental attitudes. And this is a shift from earlier eras as a consequence of the arrival of Sesame Street. There was educational content for children before Sesame Street, but Sesame Street really demonstrated that you could teach children numbers and letters and content that would be important for schooling, and that it was quite positive. In fact, the research of John Wright, Elisa Houston, Dan Anderson, and their colleagues demonstrated through the Early Window Project and the Recontact study that children who engaged in planned educational programming attention as 3 and 4 year olds, 3 to 5 year olds, had a step up in performance at 3rd grade and were set off on a trajectory so that even into high school they were performing better than those who did not start off with planned educational programming. And indeed, the Sesame Street effect taught parents and others that television could have a very positive influence on children's lives. That was coupled with research that was going on at the same time in the 70s and 80s that began to demonstrate that children are not passive viewers of television, that television watching is an active process, and that television viewing for children is a consequence of the comprehensibility of the content and the ways in which the children actively attempt to make sense of the programming, which could be influenced by the content, the zooms, the camera cuts, the formal features, and other aspects of attention. So we have an active child viewer who can learn from media, and what happens? Ever younger age groups of children then become the market for educational content. Until today, we have a proliferation of content for babies under the age of 2. And the question is raised again. Can babies learn from TV? We know 4 and 5 year olds can, but can babies learn from these content? And it is not at all clear that they can. In fact, what we see today is a proliferation of new studies, we were presented yesterday, about the use of baby videos with young children. What do we know about it? We know that parents believe that it's a positive thing. In fact, I understand that baby Einsteins are the #1 baby shower gift in America today. And they believe that they're somehow providing their children with a step up in life if they can expose them to educational content via videos. There's some suggestion, this is research by Dan Anderson and his students, that up to about 30 months, there's something called a video deficit, which may be that it takes many, many more repetitions to learn from a video than it does from real life presentation of information. And we don't know really what causes that video deficit. And indeed, we know that parent-child interaction around video is as important as anything else in what children will learn from these videos. That's kind of an overview of the content issues. New issues arise in the digital media age. I've only mentioned 3. There's some suggestion that interactivity in digital media is the most powerful source of learning as a tool for children to learn from the content. Great concern about the networking advantages of the internet, who children are talking to, not just predators, but YouTube and all these sharing of information. And there's great interest in whether children will become much more media literate as they become creators of media content. With that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Justine, who's going to talk about some of the other issues.